largely related to that, then how does that change the conversation? It seems to me it changes the conversation a lot. If we say there's a difference between whites and a particular minority group, and then we see, okay, for some minorities in that minority group are disadvantaged when we look at maybe some latent class kind of things. Then it's like, well, why? It's not really their ethnicity. What is the reason? And if we switch it to less resources, well, now we can do something about it. If we said students in schools with this level of resources versus students in schools with this level of resources, where is the diff? Then that's very powerful. We say, oh, students at the poor schools are doing worse. Maybe then we could give them resources. Because what's the difference of saying white student versus non-white student? What are we going to do? It's making it easy for us to just say, well, there's nothing we can do. We're not going to change your ethnicity, obviously, right? So, turning our diff focus to kind of actionable kinds of diff and actionable kinds of groups to look at, I think would make the issue of fairness in diff more obvious and lead to more productive ways to think about education and how to improve education and education fairness. And these routine kind of diff procedures that we have to do on certain protected groups should continue to be done from a legal fairness point of view. But in terms of really improving education and fairness for all students, I think we should broaden our notion of what those groups are and try to really get at some of those characteristics that might actually be disadvantaging students that we can change. The last thing I'll say, because I know I'm running out of time, is that I feel like I've said this 5 times at NERA the last 2 days, but in theory, our assessments are changing from multiple choice tests that are pretty well understood at this point to these exciting, complex, innovative assessments. And I know we're all going to not hold our breath until they actually appear. But when they do appear, because someday they'll appear, we have to think about then diff. I think the issues of diff become even more complicated because we're thinking about new kinds of skills. How are students interacting with technology? We're going to have these technology-rich items that require all of these different types of skills just around the technology and not even necessarily around the intended construct to be measured. And then we have to decide, but what part of using technology is part of the intended construct? And so our notions of construct relevant and irrelevant variance are going to change. The types of students that might have advantages and disadvantages might change. And so as we move to this next generation of assessments, hopefully, as researchers, we'll also move our research thinking beyond that of what we've done with traditional paper, pencil, multiple choice, or computerized multiple choice, it's the same thing, right? Format to these more innovative, complex assessments that are measuring multiple skills at the same time. And how does the effect of that, more multidimensional items affect how we look at fairness for different groups of students? So, in conclusion and summary, I think that unfortunately diff becomes routine and prescribed, and for operational testing companies, it's another, I'm not saying that they don't care about fairness, I don't mean it to sound that way, but it's an item on a checklist. I've done my equating, I've done my diff, I've done this, I've done that, and it's like, okay, so I'm done. And I think because of that, we lose some of the time to be thoughtful about thinking about fairness because we kind of think we have it covered by doing our diff analyses. So I encourage researchers to help come up with ways to think about diff that can be maybe even routinized because they don't have a lot of time. I mean, they don't have time to sit and ponder about fairness. But researchers do have time to sit and ponder about fairness and how we could maybe change or modify diff procedures so that operational testing folks can use that information to think about fairness more broadly. So let's just be more thoughtful about what we're doing as we move forward in thinking about diff. And I think we will be well served.
Master from James Madison University, and I think the reason that Jonathan asked me to come here is because at James Madison University, we have an assessment office there, the Center for Assessment and Research Studies, and we basically provide assessment consultation to programs on campus and different student affairs programs as well. So we're involved with measurement quite a bit, and we measure a wide variety of things. We might do some achievement testing, content knowledge, but there's also a lot of what, people hate the word non-cognitive, but a lot of non-cognitive things that we also measure with the undergraduate students there. So things like their achievement goal orientation, or what kind of learning strategies they use, or even their test-taking effort. So there's a lot of non-cognitive things that we are measuring. And when we go about comparing groups on these non-cognitive things, we want to make sure that the instruments we are using are operating similarly for those two groups before we make any kind of group comparisons. So we work, they don't call it diff when we're dealing with these kind of scales, or at least the technique that we're using, even though it's the same thing as diff. We use techniques known as measurement and variance. Okay? So that's what I'm going to be talking to you guys about. I'm not sure how familiar people in the room are about measurement and variance techniques, but I will give you an overview of how I think about them. And the reason measurement and variance, in my mind, is so important in educational research is because so many of the research questions that we have are group comparisons. So I just kind of threw out a couple research questions that involve group comparisons here. It could be, our students in the treatment group outscoring students in the control group on the state's mathematics examination. So here's a cognitive test, something that would be scored right wrong. Another question might be, are elementary school teachers in Mexico more culturally competent than teachers in the US? And maybe that's because, and I'm just making this up, I don't know anything about it, but perhaps there are more rigorous sort of cultural competency components in the teacher education system in Mexico than there is in the US. So perhaps that is a really important research question to somebody. Another one might be about student engagement, like classroom engagement of students. Does it differ are there gender differences or ethnic differences? And I totally agree with Lisa that a lot of times, we just rush to these kind of gender ethnic differences without really wondering why? Why would we ever expect there to be the differences between these groups? It's just kind of like what we always do is look at gender and ethnic differences, which sometimes seem a little arbitrary. So many of our research questions in education are group comparisons. So if we kind of move forward with that one example about cultural competency for teachers in the US and Mexico, something somebody could probably do is go out there and grab a cultural competency instrument and administer it to teachers in the two different countries. And let's say that the scale on this instrument ranges from 5 to 25. And let's say it's a self-report Likert scale sort of instrument. They might end up finding that the average score on this scale, 5 to 25, is 23 in Mexico and 18 in the US. And they might get pretty excited about that, because on a 5 to 25 point scale, you might think, wow, that seems pretty sizable. You might go, I really think that teachers in Mexico are more culturally competent than those in the US. But I think like any responsible educational researcher, before you go screaming off the rooftops about this huge difference between the means, you would ask yourself a variety of different questions, and that's what we're trying to do, right, as educational researchers, to critically evaluate our own findings and make sure before we get too excited about them that everything is set and that we can say these results are trustworthy. So things that you would be asking yourself is, well, how large were the sample sizes? Can we trust that we actually have a large enough sample to say, well, it's not just sampling error that's causing the difference between the two groups. And the representativeness, what am I saying? Representatives, sorry, are the samples. Of course you're going to ask yourself that question. Was the data collected under similar conditions? So you're kind of making sure that the quality of the results are high so that you can trust the results. And everybody jumps, of course, to, well, what about the scale? Is this a good